to welcome you to the Upper Room once again. What a privilege it is to get to be a part of your lives, and we don't take that lightly. I want to start by telling you about a guy that was probably about my age, so a very young guy, and he started to notice that his eyes were bulging a little bit, and he had ringing in his ears that was starting to really bother him a lot. So he went to the doctor and asked him about it. The doctor did some tests, and the doctor decided that he needed a tonsillectomy. He needed his tonsils out. So they took his tonsils out, and it didn't help at all. Nothing was better. So he went to a dentist, and the dentist said, "Yeah, I've seen this before. We're going to have to extract all your teeth." So they extracted all his teeth, and were planning to put new teeth in for him, but it didn't make any difference at all for him. And so finally he went to a different doctor, and the doctor said, "Yeah, there's a long name for this, and the bad news is you've only got 6 months to live." And so the man walked out of the doctor's office and just thought, wow, what do I do now? He decided, he had some money, he decided to just start treating himself to the very best. He bought a brand new fast car and got new clothes. In fact, he got brand new $1,000 suits, and he had everything tailored to fit him so it was comfortable. He found a shirt designer in the city in which he lived who could design shirts that would be just perfect for him. So he went to this shirt designer. The guy started measuring him, and he measured his arms and said, okay, there's 18 inches, and measured his chest. And then he went to measure his neck, okay, 16 inches. And the guy said, "No, I've measured my neck before. It's 15 inches. And he says, "No, it's 16. And he says, "No, I'm telling you, I've worn a 15 neck my whole life, pretty much." And the shirt designer, the tailor, said to him, he said, "If you keep doing that, your eyes are going to bug out and you're going to have ringing in your ears." I tell you that story because I think it's a pretty good illustration of how complicated we make our lives when we don't have to. And that to me is one of the many beauties of Jesus' teaching. And that is that he makes things simple enough for people like me to understand. And the passage we're going to get in today is just that. It is one of the most beautiful passages of Scripture, and yet it is not complicated. It is so simple that even you and I can figure this out. A 3-year-old could probably understand what Jesus is about to say. But before we get into the passage, let me ask you a discussion question. And that is, in what ways do you think maybe you've made Christianity more complicated than it needs to be? Or maybe you were taught that Christianity was much more complicated than what it really is? Talk about that for just a moment. In reality, following Jesus is not that complicated. I had a friend this week text me and wanted to talk about being a disciple of Jesus, and I think he was shocked at how uncomplicated it is. He was thinking I would have this complicated methodology for him to follow, and I told him it's not that complicated. You decide to follow Jesus and do what he says, and begin to learn to see life as Jesus sees it. And so we had a great conversation, but it reminded me of this great quote from Louis Giglio, where he said, "Don't overcomplicate God's will. Just stay connected to Jesus. Love him, look into his eyes, he will lead you, follow, repeat." Isn't that great? Just repeat that. You get that down and just repeat it. So we're in this series, in the Sermon on the Mount, we're calling the Lucky Ones. And last week we were in Matthew chapter 7, where Jesus said, "Ask, seek, knock, continually." And it wasn't as much about prayer, although we said it could be certainly applied to prayer, as much as it was about generally seeking to live in God's kingdom. And so that's what we talked about. And so, as we mentioned last week, that lesson, that teaching from Jesus leads us into quite a quandary, doesn't it? Most of us are living in a culture that has at least somewhat convinced us that you can't be sure that God is good. And yet, Jesus says God is always good. And this culture has led us to believe that we are good. That's one of the most basic phrases you'll hear. Well, man is basically good. And yet Jesus called us evil, if you remember that. And so, having said that, we get into this next passage. But before we leave that quandary, I want to read to you from John Piper's book, Providence, where he says, God is not sinful nor capricious. If we are prone to be critical rather than be changed, we should put our hands on our mouths and listen. We are sinful and finite. God is holy. And then he quotes Isaiah 55, verse 8 and 9, where God says, my ways are higher than your ways. My thoughts are higher than your thoughts. With that in mind, then, we are led right into verse 12 of chapter 7. And he says famously, I'm sure you've heard this before, so in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you. For this, Jesus says, sums up the law and the prophets. That's all we're going to talk about today. It's only going to last about 3 minutes. Which, you may have heard that verse called the Golden Rule. Have you ever heard that? The Golden Rule, which brings us to our setting today. Our very frigid setting. We're up at Pitkin, Colorado, 9,000 feet, and it's a wind chill somewhere in the mid-teens, maybe. We're here for a reason. This area right here, and several little towns around here, and they are little towns, were once just absolutely crazy towns of 2,000 people because they were mining communities. Pitkin is a mining community. So in the late 1800s, it was a bustling place. And now it's pretty sleepy, pretty quiet. We came through Ohio City, and the creek that runs through Ohio City is called Gold Creek. Why? Because in these here hills you see around me, at one time, gold was coming down the streams, and gold was being found in the mountains. In fact, those mountains behind me, just over my shoulder, I believe you can see, if you just get over the top of that mountain and drop down a few miles, you come to a place called Tin Cup, Colorado. That's actually where we wanted to film, but I think there's about 2 feet of snow that you got to wade through to get into it. So we decided to go the easier route today. So that's why we're here. This place at one time was all about gold, and it was a raucous time, as it was in many mining towns in Colorado and other places. You know, the 49ers were famous because they found gold in 1849 in California. Here it was more like 1859 when James Taylor, right over that mountain, found gold, and the river that flows down that side of the mountain is called Taylor River and Taylor Reservoir, because of how famous he became as he brought some gold down from a stream in a tin cup, and thus the name of that sleepy little, almost ghost town, Tin Cup. All that to say, it's about gold. This place is about gold. It was at one time. And so for a time, this area, these little villages almost, were all about gold and then silver, but the reality is that time ran out, and the question becomes, when we look at the golden rule that Jesus gives us, and I think it's named that because of how precious it is. As precious as gold is, the gold standard of living in the kingdom then is found right here in verse 12. In everything you do, treat others as you would want them to treat you. Now, the thing that hits me about what Jesus says here that I want to pass on to you, and we'll get to the meaning of what he says, but stepping back, what hits me when I read that one verse is how brilliant Jesus' teaching is. And I know I've said that before, but you need to know that his teaching is so brilliant that it's a shame that we don't mine it more often. Now, some of that brilliance has been passed on to us from Jesus. I mean, generally, man can be very brilliant. We were actually going to film between Montrose and Delta on this 20-acre lot that has probably thousands of solar panels on it. Because I love the idea of a solar panel. It's brilliant what we've come up with as mankind to think we can harness the energy of the sun and actually create energy to live by. It's a great idea. Now, I'm tempted to now spend the next half hour talking about the downside. Let me just mention it. The downside of the brilliance of man is that at some point we get real stupid, you know. So it's brilliant to try to harness the sun, and we're doing it to some extent. The idea that every car in this nation should run off of electricity soon is really a dumb idea. Sorry. It's really, we've lost our brilliance at that point. I want to quote to you from a guy by the name of Mark Mills. And Mark Mills is the senior fellow at MIT, and his advanced degrees are in physics. Here's what he says about the fact that every car should have a battery in it and that would really work out well. He says, even if you cover the entire continent of the United States with solar panels, you wouldn't supply half of America's electricity. Even if you added a Washington Monument-sized wind turbines spread all over the area 6 times greater than the state of New York, that wouldn't be enough. What we've done is have our energy systems designed by bureaucrats instead of engineers. We got worse energy, more expensive energy, and higher environmental impacts. Okay. So now we know that man is able to be brilliant, and then we go right back into ignorance again. That's not the case with the golden rule. The purity of the golden rule that Jesus speaks here in verse 12 is brilliance with no downside whatsoever. And so let's get into that. To make sure you're with me on the idea of how brilliant the teaching of Jesus really is, I want to go back to a couple passages. The first one is in Mark 1, verse 21. They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, Jesus went into the synagogue and began to teach. The people were amazed at his teaching, because he taught them as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law. Just then a man in their synagogue who was possessed by an evil spirit cried out, "What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us?" "I know who you are," says the demon. "You are the Holy One of God." Jesus says sternly, "Be quiet, come out of him." The impure spirit shook the man violently and came out with a shriek. Okay, that shows you the power Jesus has over even the demons who know him. But the brilliance was right there before it when it talked about the fact that nobody taught like Jesus. Let's move on to John chapter 7, verse 45. Finally, the temple guards went back to the chief priests and the Pharisees, who asked them, "Why didn't you bring him," meaning Jesus, "in? We told you to bring him in." And the guards said this to the priest, "No one ever spoke the way this man does," the guard replied. Okay, the people of Jesus' time, and there are other places where they say, no one taught like him. There's such brilliance in what he teaches, and that's what I want to talk about for the next couple minutes, or as long as I can handle being out here. Did you notice I'm not talking with my hands? I know, I hate talking with my hands, but it's a habit. The way to cure the habit is about a 12-degree wind chill. Here we go. The first thing you need to know, again reading it, the golden rule, "In everything do to others as you would have them do to you," and this sums up the law and the prophets. The first thing in his teaching right here is that we see that it's consuming. And we get that from the word everything. Jesus says that it doesn't matter what the context is. It doesn't matter with whom you are interacting. This applies to all situations. It applies with your kids. It applies with your spouse. It applies with your coworkers and your boss. It applies with your neighbors. In everything, he says, much like Paul said in Colossians chapter 3, verse 17, "And whatever you do, in word or deed," whether you're talking or doing something, "do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God through him." Okay, so it's consuming. His teaching is to consume us in everything. We've done a good job of compartmentalizing our lives, haven't we? and we visit the words of Jesus instead of let them consume us. So that's the first part of this teaching that is brilliant. The second part is that he capsizes an idea. What do I mean by that? He turns it upside down. And this idea that we should treat others in the way we want to be treated ourselves was actually something that had been around for some time when Jesus said these words. He wasn't the one who originated it. In fact, Jewish leaders had said it for years. Hillel is recorded to having said it, and other religions picked it up, but they always said it in the negative. Don't do to others what you don't want them to do. That's significant that Jesus is the only one to capsize that statement, turn it upside down, and say it in the positive. And I believe personally that he did that so that we would begin to learn the difference between religion and relationship. But it does make me wonder, and I want to ask you this question. It doesn't have to be a discussion question. And that is, have you been mired in religion? Have you ever believed that Christianity was a religion? Have other people convinced you that this is a religious thing we do? Because if that's the case, that is the opposite of what Jesus is saying here. You see, the negative way that that statement was always made sounds and lives like religion. Don't do this, don't do that. A bunch of rules, right? Like don't drink, don't chew, and don't go with girls who do. Don't dance, don't play cards, don't have any fun. And that's why those things are always in the negative. And yet Jesus didn't approach it that way. In fact, he actually detested the religious people, the people who led the religion of the day. And I pick up in Matthew 23, verse 2, and it says this. Jesus is teaching, and he says, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees are the official interpreters of the law of Moses. So practice and obey whatever they tell you, but don't follow their example. For they don't practice what they teach. All right, we'll get back to that. They crush people with unbearable religious demands and never lift a finger to ease the burden. Everything they do is for show. On their arms, they wear extra wide prayer boxes with scripture verses inside, and they wear robes with extra long tassels. See, their clothing was really important to them, like most religious people. And they love to sit at the head table and banquets and in the seats of honor in the synagogues. They love to receive respectful greetings as they walk in the marketplaces and to be called rabbi. Okay, Jesus makes his point, right? What he says is that religious people have their beliefs not match their behavior. They love to look and appear religious. They love to talk in a religious way. And they crave respect and admiration. If you find yourself ever experiencing any of those things with yourself or with others, know that they are deeply steeped in religion. And I believe one of the reasons Jesus turned this thing upside down and made it, hey, this is the way we live, instead of here are the rules you can't break, is because he was beginning in his brilliance to teach us the difference between religion and relationship, which the Jewish people had no idea about. The third thing I've noticed about how brilliant just this one line from Jesus really is that he calculates. Now, what do I mean by that? He now is going to calculate how he can help us do something that we find very difficult. All right, this is my favorite part of the four that we'll cover, the four brilliant parts of the teaching of Jesus just in this one verse. Let's read this verse again. You'll have it memorized by the time we get to the end of this lesson. He says, so in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. All right, Jesus knows your greatest battle and my greatest battle is selfishness. To put ourselves in the center of everything in our lives is truly our greatest temptation. Don't you find yourself, quite honestly, every time you hear or experience something saying, what's in it for me? Or how will this affect me? That is basically how we all live, and Jesus knows that about us, and look what he does. It's so brilliant what he does. I don't know if you ever noticed this. He uses that tendency of us, that basic selfish nature, to get us to a place where we actually learn to live in his kingdom in a very tangible way. Jesus now moves us from selfishness to otherness, number one, and number two, he now makes the abstract concrete. First of all, otherness. And when I say otherness, I'm not saying that you live a life where you care about what people think about you all the time, or you want to please people all the time. Otherness is the idea that you are constantly thinking of what's best for others. Otherness is a staple of life in the kingdom of God. And it is something that must be trained into us as we are simultaneously training out our selfishness. So that's the first thing you need to know, is that living in the kingdom is a life of otherness that the rest of the people in the world do not understand and cannot comprehend why we would live that way. The second part, though, I find intriguing, and that is he moves us in this statement from the abstract to the concrete. Here's what I mean by this. You might remember what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 22, verse 35. One of the experts in the law tested him with the question, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments." Does that sound familiar? It's very familiar. Almost the same exact language as what we find in verse 12 in the Golden Rule, right? It's very much the same. Here's our problem, and I think, again, Jesus knew this. Love, at least in the world we live in now, love is so ambiguous. We've talked about this, right? What you might see loving, I may see as not loving at all, or what I think is loving, you may not agree at all. So that is called the Great Commandment, what Jesus just said. But if we can't agree on a definition of love, it makes no difference, right? That we do what Jesus told us to do, because we got to agree upon what it means. So John 3:16, for God so loved the world, he gave his only son. In Romans 5:8, God demonstrated his love, mean nothing if we think that love is just an emotion. That we think, as our culture does, that love is something you fall into like a mud puddle. We are clueless if we don't understand how God sees love. Let me give you an example. I ran across this last week a guy by the name of Don Miguel Ruiz, who people are calling a spiritual guru. He's a teacher and an author. And so I thought, well, I'm going to read a little bit about what he says about love. If he's a spiritual guru, you know, we all could use a spiritual guru, I guess. After I read this, you'll go, maybe we don't need a spiritual guru. This is what he wrote about love. You know, it's easy to say you love your dog because your dog doesn't have opinions about you. The dog loves you unconditionally. Can a dog love unconditionally? Don thinks so. Let's go on. This is important. Then if your partner loves you just the way you are, it's just like the dog loves you. You can be yourself with your partner. You can be a man or a woman just the way the dog can be a dog with you. So now we have a proper definition. This would be God's definition of love, right? Just live like a dog. That's what you do. On the other hand, there is a possibility there's a better definition. I want to give you a better definition that comes from Gary Chapman in his excellent book, The 5 Love Languages. He says, love requires effort and discipline. It is the choice to expend energy in an effort to benefit the other person, knowing that if his or her life is enriched by your effort, you too will find a sense of satisfaction. The satisfaction of having genuinely loved another. It does not require the euphoria of the in-love experience. In fact, true love cannot begin until the in-love experience has run its course. You get what he's saying? The in-love experience is the falling in love that everyone's enamored with in our culture. And he says that needs to run its course before you actually ever learn to love, because the key is in doing what is best in others' best interest, putting themselves before ourselves. And so it's not about becoming loving like a dog. It's about becoming loving like God, who demonstrated his love for us in that even though we were sinners, undeserving, he sent his son and sacrificed his son. See, that's love. See, but it's still kind of vague and ambiguous to most of us. But what Jesus does in this moment in time, verse 12, is he makes it very concrete. Because as we all have different ideas about what love is, and even kindness and things like that, this gets very specific, and that is, all right, you know what you like having done for you. Now do that for others. He takes that basic selfish nature we have and says, now turn it on its head. And stop thinking, once you've imagined what you want done, which we all immediately do without any hesitation, now he says, now turn it around and do that for others. Are you seeing the brilliance of how Jesus approaches this? He says, I'm gonna give you something that you'll never forget, and you can actually know whether or not you're doing it, right? Because you instantly think of what you would like done, and now you flip it and say, now I'll do that for you. Isn't that brilliant? And the fourth and final thing that I noticed about his brilliant teaching here is he consolidates. What do I mean by he consolidates? He takes all the law and the prophets, what is that? The entire Old Covenant, the entire Old Testament, and boils it down to this. He says, if you live with this approach, you have accomplished the 613 laws of the Old Covenant. Wow! Thank you, Jesus. That's brilliant. As religion makes behavior and life so much more complicated, and I feel for all you who grew up Catholic, how complicated that is to have somebody tell you how many Hail Marys to throw up. I love the simplicity of Jesus. Jesus says, let me take all 613 laws and make it into one verse, and it's really easy to understand. Everybody can understand it. Again, a 3-year-old can understand this. He consolidates it all because he knows our finite minds. He knows how limited we really are in our own brilliance. I just love the brilliance of his teaching. I hope you can see it now, that something we may just whiz on by needs to be put under the microscope to see just how brilliant Jesus is. That's going to come into play here in just a moment. So the content of what Jesus teaches is simply remarkable. But again, the way he approaches communicating to us, his children, is just absolutely brilliant. And so the takeaway is going to be given to you through a discussion question, then we'll follow up. So the discussion question is this. Now that we know what we know about the brilliance of Jesus' teaching, why do you think it is that we so seldom mine his teaching? And you could say mind his teaching as well, but I mean mine it since we're in a mining town. Why don't we dig into his teaching all the time is the question. We've spent so little time, truthfully, if we're honest, digging deep into Jesus' teaching and making sure we understand it. Why do you think we spend so little time doing that? All right, I quote Dallas Willard all the time. Some of you down there in the Tucson area call Dallas Willard Dillard because it's too much work to say Dallas Willard. In his great book, The Divine Conspiracy, he puts it this way. The assumption of Jesus' program for his people on earth was that they would live their lives as his students. And that's what we're getting at. Why are we not just these passionate students of Jesus, knowing now how brilliant his teaching is and how life-changing it truly is? In fact, it's been said, and we've said it, that the lack of discipleship, the non-discipleship in the church is the elephant in the church. It is the big thing that nobody wants to talk about, that we are not raising up and becoming students of Jesus, apprentices of Jesus. And that was my message to my friend this last week, who lives hundreds of miles away. It was, if you want to be interested in discipleship, it's time you get serious about following, learning, and apprenticing under Jesus. One more quick quote from Dallas Willard on this subject. Being a disciple or apprentice of Jesus is a quite definite and obvious kind of thing. There is no good reason why people should ever be in doubt as to whether they themselves are his students or not. The evidence, he says, will always be quite clear as to whether any other individual is his student. In other words, if you're a student, you can't hide it. It's really obvious. So if you're wondering, you're probably not. And I take you again to one of our most common passages we read and have talked about, but just to hit it one more time, Matthew chapter 11, verse 28. Come to me, Jesus said, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, meaning come partner with me. Do life with me and learn from me. For I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. I'm not offering you something that's really difficult. I'm actually offering you the greatest deal of your lifetime. Come partner with me, learn from me, be an apprentice of mine. And why wouldn't we, now that we know how brilliant his teaching is and how life-changing it can be? I want to close by talking about a phrase that we've never talked about before. It comes from a teacher that I listen to every once in a while, and the phrase is this: shadow mission. Do you know what a shadow mission is? A shadow mission, let me give you a definition of it so that it's very easy to understand. A shadow mission is an authentic mission that has been derailed, often in imperceptible ways. In fact, we drift off our real mission to a shadow mission. What that means is, at one point possibly you knew what really God wanted from you, but you've drifted from that. And now it appears you're still on mission, but there's something missing. And my point is going to be that the golden rule is the very thing that can bring us back to the real mission, not the shadow mission. Let me illustrate it this way. Let's go back to the 5th century before Christ, where there's a king named King Xerxes, and he was the most powerful man in the world. His kingdom, they say, stretched from Asia Minor clear down into Africa and into parts of India. That's how big his kingdom was. All right, and so they had taken captive the Jews many years earlier. It wasn't under his reign that the Jews were taken captive, and some of the Jews have gone back to Jerusalem, but some had not yet gone back to Jerusalem, and that's where we pick up the story in the book of Esther. So let me run through the story real quick and make the point we want to make. So King Xerxes was not a good man. I mean, he was what you call very self-indulgent. It was all about King Xerxes. In fact, not only was he not a kind man, he was not a man of inner strength or character, so he surrounded himself with people who would tell him what to think. He was constantly asking his advisors what he should do. Okay, so for the most powerful man in the world, it's kind of strange. He had a wife who was queen. That's what wives of kings do. So his wife's name was Vashti, and Vashti was more independent, actually, than the king himself. And the first chapter of Esther is about a series of 3 parties that went on. 3 big banquets. One of them lasted 180 days. 6 months of partying. Can you imagine? And it was a wild drunk fest. At some point during that time, the queen had her own party, and it was much more respectable. They probably had tea and crumpets, as their husbands and the men of the kingdom were off making fools of themselves. But at some point, the king said, I want to show off the most important and precious item I own. What would that be? That would be his queen. And so he calls for Vashti to join him, and he's gonna show her off. And she says, no, thank you. And he's embarrassed. I mean, are you really the most powerful man in the world if you can't get your wife to do something you want her to do? It becomes the question. So he asks his advisors, I'm so embarrassed, what should I do? And they said, well, you should never let her be in your presence again. And so he got message to her that you can't ever be in my presence again. I'm guessing she didn't mind that decree since she didn't want to be in his presence at the party anyway. So then he asked his advisors, what should I do now? Well, you need to find a new queen. So when he talks to his advisors, which were probably a bunch of young men filled with testosterone, how do you think they came up with an idea to find a new queen? Do you think they brought in some women to do lectures on physics? Do you think that they had ladies come in and talk about the politics of Persian reign? No, you know what they did. Let's have a beauty contest. A beauty contest. They probably even wanted part of it to be a swimsuit competition. Anyway, there were 127 different regions in his kingdom. And so each region could send forth the woman they thought would be the most beautiful woman for him, because that's all that mattered. And in those 127 was young Esther. Now, what you need to know about young Esther is that she was orphaned as a child and was raised by her cousin Mordecai, who was her guardian and advisor. And so she wins the competition for her region. So to get ready for this beauty contest, she spends a year. Ladies, can you imagine? I know it took you a long time to get ready for dates, but a year? Did any of you spend a year? It wouldn't have been worth it if you had. She spent a year getting ready to be in this beauty pageant, and to cut to the chase, she wins it, she becomes the queen, and all is good. Now there's another plot going on, and it has to do with Mordecai, her cousin, who was at the gate when he heard that someone wanted to assassinate the king. So he tells Esther about it. She tells the king, and his life is saved. And that'll come into play later. We probably won't even talk much more about it, but that's important. Then there's another guy named Haman, and he was elevated to second in charge under the king. And one of the things this guy, who was also full of himself, wanted was for everyone to bow down to him. So Mordecai, being a very strict Jew, was not going to bow down to anyone else, worship any other man. And for Haman, that was absolutely unacceptable. So he planned to have not just Mordecai, but all the Jews killed for not bowing down to him. The little part I missed is that Esther never told the king that she was Jewish. So this means that she was in danger as well. In the end, Mordecai pulls Esther aside and famously says, "You got to do something about this." And she says, I haven't been summoned by the king for 30 days. In other words, he's got a harem of other women. We're not that close. I want a beauty pageant. That's all I am. And he says, you have to go to him. She reminds him, if I go to him without being summoned, without him raising his scepter, it will cost me my life. That's the setting when he says, but Esther, I believe it was for such a time as this that you were made queen. This is the providence of God, in other words. It's interesting that the book of Esther is the only book in the whole Bible that doesn't mention God. And yet God and his providence is all throughout it, if you read it. The point is this, she eventually says, okay, pray, I will pray and fast. I'll have my people around me pray and fast, and pray that this can happen and I don't lose my head. And she goes into the presence of the king, and she's brilliant. God gives her brilliant strategy. She sets up another party because she knows her king husband loves parties, and it's at that party that she reveals what the problem is. In the end, it's Haman, the evil Haman, the selfish Haman, that ends up being hanged for his idea to have the entire Jewish population killed. Esther famously said to her cousin, if I die, I die. If I perish, I perish, meaning I understand now this is my mission. It all works out, but I will read to you from chapter 8 how powerful all this was. For the Jews, it was a time of happiness and joy, gladness and honor. In every province and in every city to which the edict of the king came, there was joy and gladness among the Jews, with feasting and celebration. And many people of other nationalities became Jews. This actually changed the nation because she stuck to her real mission. Do you know how easy it would have been for Esther to just follow her shadow mission? Because her shadow mission was to enjoy the opulence, the luxuries, the wealth, the pleasures of being royalty. And nobody would have blamed her for that if she never said a word, but just enjoyed in the name of, I'm sure God has me here, but I'm just going to enjoy what I have, and I'm not going to risk anything. Her real mission, as Mordecai put it, your real mission is to save our entire nation. If it costs you your life, it's your mission. I love the fact that Esther did not drift from her real mission as easy as it would have been. Now, how about for you and for me? Most of us, I believe, tend to drift into a shadow mission. We want a comfortable life. We want it to be easy. We don't want to suffer. We don't want much risk involved. So it begs this question that I want you to ponder deeply. How do I know if I have drifted into a shadow mission? How would I know I drifted into a shadow mission? I believe I know I'm in a shadow mission, not the real mission, if I do not take living out the golden rule seriously. If that's not a real part of my life, because I have drifted into a place where I care more about myself than others, and yet I can camouflage it in love and kindness. And so that's really the question. Are you willing to take the brilliant teaching of Jesus, become his student, and live out what he commanded in verse 12? My other question I have for you as we close is this. Who is your Mordecai? Who is the person in your life who loves you enough to say the very difficult things to you, to keep you from drifting into a shadow mission, to keep you on track with living out the very words of Jesus? You need a Mordecai. We all need a Mordecai. Look for that person. Be grateful for that person. Don't scorn that person when they tell you something you don't want to hear. It's great to be with you as we're coming to you today in this frigid, mountainous town that was once filled with some gold. The gold has gone away. Has the gold message of Jesus left you? It's time we adhere to the teachings of Jesus. He is brilliant, and it is the standard by which we must live. Thanks for joining us.